Pleasure to rise to support this bill in the name of Jackie Dean at the committee stages, the Conservation Natural Heritage Protection Bill. I would like also to join the wave of unanimity and harmony and peace that's broken out in the House over this bill, and say that it gives me great pleasure indeed to support it. In fact, I want to thank Jackie Dean for her gracious acknowledgement of the contribution I was able to make to this bill by extending it to cover the Marine Mammals Protection Act of 1978. I'll come back to that in a moment, because the purpose of the inclusion of that act in this bill will become clear. But I have to say that in the course of thinking about whether or not there was something more that could be done with this bill, there were a number of recent cases of harm to marine mammals that had come to public attention. And I must confess that I approached the Minister of Conservation, Dr. Nick Smith, and asked him whether he would oppose or be averse to the inclusion of the Marine Mammals Act and penalties under that in this bill, so that in the process of making penalties consistent across a range of acts, that we could include harm done to marine mammals. He was very enthusiastic about that incorporation, and in fact signalled a review of marine mammals legislation and marine acts in general, which I understand he is pursuing. But he was very gracious, and I want to give him credit for that, notwithstanding the difficulties he's facing currently. I believe credit should go where credit is due, and after all, every dog has his day. As far as this bill is concerned, Mr. Chairman, the purpose that Jackie Dean brought to the Local Government and Environment Select Committee was to ensure that New Zealand's wildlife and natural and historic resources would be better protected, and this was her motivation, and I applaud her for that. It was a worthwhile effort, and I think we have made, in the course of the Select Committee, some constructive improvements jointly around the table at the Select Committee that have even strengthened further the capability of this legislation. So the problem had been, Mr. Chairman, that across a range of pieces of legislation, the penalties differed, and so it was entirely possible to commit an offence and have it receive a negligible penalty under one piece of legislation and a different penalty under another. For example, if someone were to release a stoat onto a nature reserve, the highest penalty would be $500 or 1 month imprisonment. Under the National Parks Act 1980, if a bit of a national park was carved off and converted to pasture, or a stand of trees milled, the highest penalty would have been a maximum fine of $2,500 or 3 months imprisonment. However, if the same offences happened in a conservation area, then the maximum penalty would be $10,000 or 12 months jail. And typically, national parks, protected areas, were of higher value than conservation areas. But when it came to the creatures that inhabit these special areas for us, the range of penalties made no sense, made absolutely no sense. And obviously the situation that my colleague Nikki Wagner referred to a moment ago, arising out of the member's own electorate, where the smuggling of jewelled geckos was becoming rife and hugely lucrative for the people who were engaged in it. That was, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. That was impetus enough for this bill. But what we've done in this bill that I think is highly commendable is that we have taken the Conservation Act 1987, the National Parks Act 1980, the Reserves Act 1977, the Wildlife Act 1953, the Wild Animal Control Act 1977, and added to that the Marine Mammals Protection Act 1978, and we have brought them all under the same penalty regime. So there can be no more obfuscation around damage to, harm to, stealing of, smuggling of creatures that are precious to us, whether they be eggs or whether they be live specimens. So now we have changed that, and at least we will with the passage of this legislation currently in its committee stages. So most penalties are increased to up to $100,000 for individuals and $200,000 for individuals who are acting for commercial reasons or for a company. Ongoing daily penalties are increased to up to $10,000 and $20,000 respectively for individuals and those working on behalf of a company. And breaches of bylaws incur up to $5,000 or $10,000 penalties, and this two-tiered kind of regime will make not only the monitoring but the implementation and the prosecution of this legislation consistent. So at the moment we have, without wishing to comment on a case before the court unduly, Mr. Chairman, we do have a case of a Blenheim man in front of the Nelson Court currently on charges of killing 13 female breeding seals at a seal colony on the Kaikoura coast, 2 bulls and 8 seal pups. And because of the difference in the regimes under different pieces of legislation, he is being tried under a piece of legislation that will have far lesser consequences for him than if he were being tried under another piece of legislation. And that was then, and he will be tried according to the law in place at the time of the alleged crime. And so that is happening as we speak, but no more after this. Once this gets to third reading, Mr. Chairman, it won't be people will not be able to pick and choose which piece of legislation they will contest their crime under. And the police will have an easier job of prosecuting under different pieces of legislation because the penalties will be comparable. So it will not be possible it will be easier for the police to make sure that the actions will be dealt with consistently in terms of penalties, regardless of the particular piece of legislation they are charging a person under. And that's got to be helpful. We need to protect our special fauna in this country, and that extends to marine mammals. I would also, Mr. Chairman, like to add my congratulations to the officials for the work they did. They advised us in a way that was impartial but very committed. They were very committed to what they were doing, and I recognise this as a feature of staff who work in the Department of Conservation, and I thank them for it. There are fewer and fewer of them as the days go by, but the ones who still remain remain absolutely committed to the conservation of our endangered and our special species in our jurisdictional area. And I thank the officials for their advice and for the way they made sure that what we were doing in this bill was consistent throughout. I commend it to the House, Mr Chair.
I call Maggie Berry.
Thank you, Mr Chair.